kiss for you.
Despite popular sentiment, Blackberry has its best sales in 2011, the year the iPhone 4S came out. This is also the same year Siri debuted and iMessage was released. To many people, the iPhone really killed BlackBerry's chances, but to others, it was Apple's introduction of iMessage, doing everything that, at the time, BlackBerry Messenger was able to do, but on a larger scale, with a focus on privacy, something that BlackBerry had been known for before. To me, and from the data, this really wasn't it. BlackBerry continued to do well long into the iPhone's reign and long into iMessage's reign. They began to slip around Q4 2012 into 2013 timeframe, but even then they had about 30 million devices sold in a year, which, to be fair, was about what Apple was selling in one quarter in the same timeframe. However, BlackBerry in 2013 would fail to adjust to the market, landing at about 3 to 4% of the market share, even while selling 28 to 30 million devices. This, more than anything, I think really just shows the exponential jump in phone sales between the 2011 to 2013 time. In 2011, as we can see here, BlackBerry sold 55 million phones and was at its peak with about 14% market share. And in just 2 years, while selling about half as many phones, they would drop to 3 to 4% market share, or a 75% reduction. BlackBerry was still selling phones even at its peak with the expanding market of the iPhone 4S, and only began to falter when the iPhone 5S came out in 2013. The 4S and 5S are pretty similar in that regard, and so that doesn't really, to me, explain this rapid decline in sales and in market share. So I would ask, what does? This video is about the BlackBerry Z30. BlackBerry fell both due to its lack of interest in keeping up with the iPhone, but also their own incompetence around making a better product. BlackBerry didn't need to be on par with the iPhone, it just needed something that the iPhone couldn't deliver. Instead, they try to match the iPhone's breadth of features with their own phone, mainly the Key 1 and the Key 2, but I'll get to those in a bit. It doesn't really help that Apple was also focused on privacy, which was something a key selling feature that BlackBerry devices had, and even with that, BlackBerry had that platform security that a lot of iOS early versions couldn't match. It wasn't until 2011 or 2012 when Apple really introduced the secure end-to-end messaging app iMessage, which is about 4 years after the iPhone. Whereas BlackBerry Messenger, introduced in 2005, let you have all those modern features: group chats, read and deliver receipts, multimedia sharing, location sharing, no character limit. All that was around in 2005 with the BlackBerry Messenger that was not available on iMessage. It was obviously, however, only available on BlackBerry devices, with it eventually coming out in 2013 to iOS and Android, but obviously at that point both Google Messaging and iMessage were out and had a lot of those features by that time. But overall, BlackBerry's big selling feature of their phones was that messaging platform that, for that span of time, for that 6 years from 2005 to 2011, was beneficial and a usable platform that beat both the iOS and Android versions on features. So starting in 2011, I think to many people's surprise, BlackBerry had its best year. It had 55 million devices sold during that time. It is its peak device sales, and as I said before, about 14% market share. Of all accounts, 2011 was a great year for them, but as iMessage released and the iPhone 5 and later the iPhone 5S in 2013, you can see the biggest drop-off in BlackBerry sales ever. To my surprise, BlackBerry actually had a number of touchscreen devices, like the ones they released to compete with the iPhone 5S in September 2013. This phone would effectively be their make or break moment, since while they lost a lot of market share and a lot of device sales, they could still absolutely show why BlackBerry was great, and if that's the case, sales should improve. Similar thing happened with Google, with the Pixel line. The Z30, however, was not what they needed. And so when you can no longer compete on that privacy, nor can you compete on that feature set for BlackBerry Messenger, what do? Well, in this case, BlackBerry decided to release 5 phones staggered throughout that year. They released the Z10 in January, which we'll talk about in a minute. They released the Q10, which was a keyboard phone, in April. They had another keyboard phone, the Q5, in May, and the Z30 in November, as well as a Porsche-designed one in December. If you follow BlackBerry, like I sort of did at that time, or just knew about them releasing their keyboard phones, and in the same year as the iPhone 5S, they also released 2 keyboard phones like you're expecting them to do. You're not expecting them to really do anything else. Your opinion on that company isn't magically going to change. However, in between those devices, the Z10, the Z30 came out, and those are fully touchscreen phones. No keyboard, no nothing. They're fully touchscreen phones with the BlackBerry OS 10 installed on them. The Z30, released in November, had a better 720p AMOLED display than the iPhone 5S did. However, the Z30 also had less storage. People talk all the time about iPhones having low storage. The Z30 had 16 gigs versus the iPhone's base 16, but could go up to 64. And now, obviously, it did have an expandable memory, but even 16 gigs at the time was considered pretty low. It's important to note, the reason I'm mentioning this is because the Samsung Galaxy S4 was also out at this time. It was also a very good device with an even better screen, the same battery, and better storage options, with an actual OS that ended up supporting normal apps. And that's kind of, I think, where the comparison between the Z30 and the iPhone 5S kind of become meaningless, right? The Z30 needed to be better than the Galaxy S4, another Android phone. It did not need to beat or compete with the iPhone, mainly because the iPhone was going to win on software anyway, and unfortunately, as we'll see, so was the Galaxy. Now, before I talk about the software, I do want to make something very clear. This was an incredibly expensive phone, and kind of the conversions don't really make a ton of sense unless you go back and actually see what it was. This phone, at least from what I'm able to see as like an outright purchase, not a contract purchase, this phone was inferior to a Galaxy S4. Worse screen, worse software, low storage, weaker processor, all that. The Galaxy S4, SIM-free, was about $580 in 2013. The Z30 was $850 in 2013. Now, the reason I'm able to say this is because a lot of the outlets you were able to buy it from were European, so they had the European pounds price of 530 pounds. Now, to me, you'd automatically convert that to 650 USD, which was about what the iPhone was charging at the time, and say, okay, yep, that makes sense, right? But you got to remember, especially back in 2013, the pound was worth 62% more than the dollar was. Right now, it's at 24%, right? So when you take that into account and you realize 530 pounds back then was actually equivalent to 850 US dollars, if you were to, do the same conversion for the other one, you would get vastly different pricing. Adjusted for inflation, the 530 pound, 850 USD device in 2013 is equivalent nowadays to a top-of-the-line Samsung or iPhone device at $1,150, the top end. The S4 in today's money would be about $785, and the iPhone 5S was $880. So this phone was considerably more expensive to buy outright than basically any other phone at that time. And for that, you did not get something better than you could get with the $785, equivalent dollar S4, right? So that's just a massive jump in price that I think a lot of people don't really, connect the dots and realize, because you'll say, oh, 530 pounds, that must be 650. It's not. It's actually 850. Do the conversion, do the how that's kind of. But I think the full price of the phone does help to understand, the viability of the device. If they're selling it really high, that means that they're probably not going to expect to sell a lot of them. It's quite interesting. Getting into the history here. So obviously, let's talk about how this 33% more expensive, worse performing device handles its software. Now, to my surprise, Blackberry 10.2, which is the Android's effectively skin. Actually, no, I don't think this was Android. It was like mostly Android at the time, but it does have a couple of unique features. This is technically their own Blackberry operating system. They were later switched to Android, but right now we're dealing with Blackberry 10.2. It uses a similar swipe gesture system, actually, to the iPhone 10 that introduced in 2017. There is, quoting the Tech Radar article here, the lack of physical and capacitive buttons means everything is gesture-based. You swipe up to go back out of an app and swipe down to access the menu. When you swipe up, you'll always return to the home screen, which displays the last 4 apps you had running. Some of them will cycle to new images, like live tiles or widgets. If you swipe down from the top of the home screen, you'll open the Quick Settings menu, which will give you access to the standard Quick Settings amount. Swiping left gives you the Blackberry inbox, which is to the right is the grid apps. Tap and hold to move them around, delete them, all that stuff. There's actually some more advanced features, like being able to set custom ringtones and vibrations for each contact, which Android will later get, and a way to combine all social media app updates in the contact page of a person with the Updates tab. So, for example, if you added Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and you follow someone on that's in your contacts, you'll get those updates on that contact thing. A pretty interesting idea right there. BlackBerry Messenger obviously was still around at this time, and while it was definitely useful, in 2013 at this point it was also on other devices, so that wasn't really a selling feature. Overall, I would say though, the familiarity of the software in comparison to things like Android and even later versions of iOS is really commendable, and the newer Updates tab on the Contacts and BlackBerry Hub tried to consolidate all the social media, email, text, and other information from the phone ecosystem into one place. You even have elements that many will assume have aged poorly. The browser has all the features you expect. The camera app even has the whole time shift feature, which basically allows you to take 5 shots and pick the best frame from each one, right? All this quality didn't really matter because ultimately the BlackBerry World app was not at the same level as the App Store or the Play Store. The browser mentioned before that had all the features was not the only option. If you didn't like it, you could download alternatives from the Blackberry app world, or BAW as I will be calling it. BAW didn't have Chrome or other popular browsers. You'll have to make do without things like Google Maps or Chrome. There's no Netflix or other specific European, as this was a popular European stuff, so there's no Sky News or Sky Go or anything like that. And you would also be without Skype or Discord or any other whatever Microsoft had at the time, that kind of thing. There was no communication, not many communication apps. The majority of apps on BAW as well that were available were basically quick ports of Android apps without much consideration for the Blackberry sort of at the time forward-thinking gesture-based system. Many apps didn't work well without the inclusion of a dedicated back button, or were missing a ton of features because of that. Now we go on to kind of the onboard apps. The onboard photo app couldn't create albums unless you linked it to your PC with a special Blackberry Link application. The music app was basic and had less content than iTunes. The movies app was in a similar vein, less content, more expensive. The Maps app. The built-in Maps app was slow, sluggish, poorly updated, and very information limited with its weak search results. And so overall, all the Blackberry apps, other than I guess the Hub, which was like the Mail app, were worse versions of existing Apple or Google apps, and on the phone this expensive and intending to compete with the best of the best from Apple and Samsung, the limited lockdown nature of it just wouldn't work. The lack of developer care, making Blackberry 10.2 specific apps, and the quality issues with the native apps meant that while usability of the device was pretty modern, the actual day-to-day use was not. Many outlets settled on this 3.5 out of 5 rating, admiring stuff like its quality feel and flagship output, but marring stuff like the price, the app compatibility, and ultimately the lack of a competitive edge. It was a good phone, but it was definitely not a compelling one. Kind of an important piece of info I kind of left out here until now is that the Z30 is actually the second attempt to save the Blackberry brand. Blackberry went all out on the Z10, their cheaper, considerably worse model that released at the start of 2013. To quote the Forbes review of the Z30, Blackberry bet the house on the Z10 and the market did not buy into, resulting in an almost $1 billion write-down to the overproduction of the Z10. While the Z30 is an improvement in almost every area, hardware and software, Blackberry has much less goodwill from the consumers still to buy into Blackberry 10's powered handheld, and as a company, Blackberry is not in a position that promotes long-term confidence. And I think from this point, it really goes to show that both the Z10 and the Z30 failed to gain any attention from this, and it's because they lost that trust that they were kind of building with the Z10. Z10 doesn't work, they try to get with a more flagship offering, and that also doesn't work. I kind of equated to something like the Pixel 5 and Pixel 6, where the Pixel 5 was realizing that Google couldn't really compete with it, so they made like a mid-range phone, and then they were able to kind of get back to making a higher-end phone with the Pixel 6, and luckily the 6 was good enough that Google was able to continue making phones, which was pretty good, and kind of gain back that market share. It didn't happen, however, with Blackberry. So from this point, the Z10, the Z30 failed to gain any attention, and the lack of confidence from the developers and ultimately grit from Blackberry in terms of updates spell the end for their relevance. And I kind of do believe that if the Z30 had launched at around that $650 USD price point the iPhone 5S had, and had kind of held on to that developer support, it definitely could have risen above and become a third player. Windows Phone at this time was still going, and people were still, relatively optimistic. So there was definitely room for more operating systems at the time. There ultimately, I just think, wasn't that confidence in Blackberry. And I think you can really see this clear as day by how the Z30 was released. It was in between 4 other phones that year. There was no major marketing or special event. There was no hype, no stage setting. It was just another phone launched that year. The company already had released 3 other phones that year, 2 of which were still the keyboard slabs they were making before. Say what you will about stuff like the iPhone X's launch, it was definitely a statement, but it was a statement saying Apple was no longer making the same form factor they started with the 5 in 2013. Going forward from that year in 2017, the iPhone X was the new design language they would usher the brand into new heights and all that. It was a risky move, but I definitely think it was done in complete confidence of what they had. Blackberry didn't do that. At no point was the Z10 or the Z30 the focus of their stuff. It was never the kind of point that was like, hey, guess what? The Z30 is going to be great. It's going to be this great thing. We're getting rid of all of our other phones. We're doing this instead. They weren't able to do that. And ultimately, because of that, I think that's a large part of why they ended up losing that audience. There was no resounding, this is our next step. This is where we're going to. And you can ultimately see that in kind of what happens next. BlackBerry Mobile effectively dissolves its mobile division, only releasing the BlackBerry Priv in November 2015. It got picked up later by TCL, which made the Key 1 in February 2017 and the Key 2 about a year and a half later. All three devices ran normal Android. They had abandoned that BlackBerry kind of experience in OS that everyone kind of thought they were going to, right? Which obviously doesn't bring much confidence, right? They weren't able to stick through even beyond an entire year. They, later on, obviously, as I said here, released 3 phones after the fact that don't run on BlackBerry OS. The Key 1 and the Key 2 being more BlackBerry shaped than the traditional style of a Priv phone. Priv was basically just like a Z30 again, but running Android, which I think might have helped it stay a little bit more relevant. The Key 1 was actually deemed a success, selling 850,000 units, and the Key 2 was not a success. Both phones kind of stopped production from TCL in 2020. There was an attempt around this time to revive the mobile division of BlackBerry with new phones in the US by Onward Mobility, which was a startup. It got started around August of 2020. The company shut down 2 years later and never released anything. BlackBerry Limited at this point is now mostly focused on that software and security in the enterprise communication field. So ultimately, I really do think that a lot of people don't talk about the Z10, the Z30. They talk about the Key, they talk about the Priv, the Passport, all that. They talk about the iPhone's launch, and at least from what I've been able to see, that's not what happened. They were doing well, and they only stopped doing well when they started losing that goodwill from customers that they were actually going to commit to anything, right? They never committed. They released 2 keyboard phones in the same year. They released 2 normal phones, and they didn't run Android. And then when they basically dissolved, they did run Android, and it never really helped them kind of stand out with that competitive viability. The iPhone isn't really what killed them. The iPhone definitely sped up the process, but I even think at this point, I'm not 100% sure on sales numbers, but the Windows phone was doing better than BlackBerry's at the time, right? And no one had confidence in that. But it was just a thing where they partnered, Microsoft partnered, they released the Nokias, they had a consistent brand identity that they were able to kind of latch behind, and with Apple taking that privacy focus, BlackBerry couldn't really do that anymore. And so they just had these phones that were comically expensive and comically overdone and not enough specs and stuff. And they ultimately, can't compete with that. So I hope that was interesting. Hope you kind of found use out of that. I try to go in as much and gather this research as much as I can. All this is original. I'm not, copying off anything. There's not plagiarism here. I quoted stuff. I'm just trying to kind of make it a little bit more interesting, because I do think this is an interesting story. And then when I was looking at the data, I was actually quite shocked. I'm like, wow, despite popular sentiment, as I said at the top, BlackBerry didn't fall in 2011 and in 2010 with the iPhone. They actually had the best year ever. And so I was really interested to see, okay, what ended up happening. And it turns out the Z10, the Z30 happened. $1 billion loss on a Z10 is quite rough. So hopefully you found that interesting. I should have more content on this channel as well as the second channel. Sub to the first channel here if you like tech content. Second channel if you like gaming content, as well as some other tech in gaming content. And I'll see everyone in the next video.